There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people think they understand. They have seen the photographs, they have read the headlines, they have watched the films where young men come home broken or don't come home at all, and they believe that the tragedy of that war was primarily a failure of understanding, that the country didn't grasp what it was doing until it was too late, that the soldiers were misunderstood, that the commanders were overconfident, that the politicians were naive. That version is easier to hold. It has a shape. It has a beginning and an end. It allows for the possibility that with better information or better leadership or better intentions, things might have gone differently. But the deeper and more uncomfortable truth about Vietnam is not that it was misunderstood. It is that it was misrepresented deliberately, systematically, and from multiple directions at once, and that the misrepresentation was not a flaw in the system, but a feature of it, something that the institutions involved required in order to keep functioning. The war continued not in spite of the lies, but because of them. The lies were not decoration applied to a real strategy. They were the strategy. This is what makes Vietnam so difficult to look at directly even now, more than 50 years after the last American combat troops withdrew, and more than 40 years after the fall of Saigon. The discomfort is not purely historical. It lives in the structure of how institutions manage information, how military hierarchies process failure, how governments translate catastrophic ambiguity into legible policy, and how ordinary people, soldiers and officers and analysts and civilians, adapt when the truth they are living cannot be reconciled with the truth they are required to report. Vietnam did not produce that gap. It revealed it. And the revelations came slowly enough that by the time most people could see clearly what had happened, the war had already consumed more than 58,000 American lives, and somewhere between 2 and 3 million Vietnamese lives, depending on which count you accept and which categories of death you include. The Army did not want certain things discussed. That is not a conspiracy theory. It is documented. It is visible in the declassified cables and the Pentagon papers and the unit after action reports and the testimony of soldiers who returned and tried to explain what they had seen and found that the institutions around them had no real mechanism for receiving that information. What was suppressed was not always specific facts. Sometimes it was tone. Sometimes it was context. Sometimes it was simply the admission that a particular metric had stopped measuring anything real, that the number being reported bore no relationship to the situation on the ground, but that the reporting had developed its own momentum, and no one at the relevant level was willing to be the person who stopped it. Body count was the most famous of these metrics, but it was not the only one. It was simply the one that most clearly illustrated the larger problem, which was that the American military in Vietnam had no reliable way to measure progress toward its actual objective, and so substituted measurements that were achievable for measurements that were meaningful. In a conventional war, territory changes hands, lines move on maps, cities fall or are held. There is a geography of winning that everyone can read. Vietnam did not offer that geography, or rather, it offered geography that kept resetting. Territory that could be cleared and then require clearing again 6 weeks later. Villages that could be secured on paper while remaining contested in practice. The military needed something to show Washington, and Washington needed something to show the public, and body count filled that need even as it hollowed out everything around it. The pressure to produce high body counts came from the top, and it moved downward through every level of the chain of command. Commanders were evaluated partly on the basis of the enemy casualties their units reported. This created an incentive structure that had nothing to do with military reality and everything to do with institutional performance. Units inflated figures. Individual kills were counted multiple times as bodies moved or were shared across unit boundaries. Civilians killed during operations were frequently listed as enemy combatants, sometimes under the actual designation used in official language at the time, which described them as enemy killed in action, other. That category, enemy killed in action, other, appears in enough documents that it is not possible to treat it as occasional or incidental. It was a routine administrative solution to a routine problem, which was that the people being killed were not always the people the military was supposed to be killing, and the paperwork needed to reflect otherwise. The soldiers who participated in this knew what they were doing. Most of them were not enthusiastic about it. Many were deeply uncomfortable with it. But the discomfort did not produce resistance in most cases because the structure of the military made resistance nearly impossible. A private could not override his sergeant. A sergeant could not override his lieutenant. A lieutenant who filed accurate reports that contradicted his captain's reports was a lieutenant whose career in the military had effectively ended. The system was not designed for truth-telling in adverse circumstances. It was designed for compliance. And compliance in Vietnam meant learning, very quickly, that what you reported and what you experienced were two different things that existed in parallel without ever quite touching. This parallel reality was one of the most psychologically destructive features of the war for the men who fought it. Soldiers are trained to operate in a coherent reality. They are trained to understand their mission, to execute it, and to evaluate whether they succeeded. In Vietnam, the mission was frequently unclear, the enemy was indistinguishable from the civilian population, the success criteria were undefined or actively fictional, and the evaluation process was corrupted at every level. Men went out on patrol and came back and wrote reports, and those reports went up the chain of command and became part of briefings, and the briefings became part of cables to Washington, and none of it bore a reliable relationship to what had actually happened in the field. This was not experienced as a dramatic crisis by most people involved. It was experienced as a persistent, low-level wrongness, a background noise of falseness that was always there, but that most people learned to filter out because there was no alternative. The alternative would have been to stop, and stopping was not something the institutional structure permitted. The logic of escalation had its own internal consistency. Each increase in troop levels was justified by the argument that the previous level had been insufficient. Each extension of bombing campaigns was justified by the claim that the previous campaign had been disrupted by self-imposed restrictions. Each expansion of the war into new areas, Laos, Cambodia, the North, was justified by the claim that the enemy was exploiting American restraint. The logic was circular and self-sealing. It never arrived at a conclusion that required stopping, because stopping would have required admitting that the foundational assumptions of the entire enterprise were wrong, and the institutional cost of that admission was higher than the institutional cost of continuing. The cost in lives was not an institutional cost in any practical sense. The men who died were not members of the institutions that made the decisions. They were products of the draft. A cross-section of American society that was, over time and with increasing sophistication, weighted toward the poor, toward racial minorities, toward men without educational deferments or family connections or medical exemptions. The people who bore the weight of the war were largely not the people who designed or sustained it. This was not accidental. The draft system created a buffer between the decision-making class and the consequences of its decisions, and that buffer was one of the things the Army did not want discussed. Not because it was a secret, but because the open acknowledgement of it would have raised questions about the war's legitimacy that were more difficult to manage than questions about its strategy. The question of who was dying and why it was disproportionately certain kinds of Americans became impossible to ignore by the mid-1960s. African-American soldiers were serving in combat at rates that exceeded their proportion of the population in the early years of the war. They were dying at rates that, in some periods, were significantly higher than their share of the military. This was documented. It was reported internally. It was not changed quickly or decisively, and in the meantime it was not amplified or publicized by the military because it would have made the draft appear as exactly what it was, which was a system that functioned differently for different Americans depending on their resources and social position. The men who went, regardless of how they got there, found a war that did not match the briefings they had received before deployment. The official description of the enemy was of guerrilla fighters operating in small cells, relying on terror and intimidation to control the population, fundamentally weak in conventional military terms. likely to collapse under sustained American pressure. The reality was a military force with sophisticated logistics, genuine popular support in significant parts of the country, a command structure that had been operating effectively for decades, and a strategic patience that American commanders persistently underestimated. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were willing to accept casualties that American military planners calculated should produce surrender or withdrawal. They did not surrender or withdraw. They absorbed the losses and continued. This continued to surprise American commanders at the highest levels, even after it had been observed consistently for years. The surprise was not innocent. It reflected a set of cultural assumptions that were never examined carefully because examining them would have been uncomfortable. American commanders assumed that the enemy's human material was less valuable to the enemy than it was to American thinking, that an Asian government would respond to the same pressure points as a European government, that a peasant-based revolutionary movement would have the same relationship to economic disruption and military attrition as a conventional nation-state. These assumptions were wrong, and they were not simply wrong in retrospect. They were wrong in ways that were knowable at the time, wrong in ways that analysts, both inside and outside the government, pointed out repeatedly, and they persisted not because the evidence was unavailable, but because the institutional investment in the assumptions was too great to allow for revision. The CIA produced assessments throughout the war that contradicted the military's optimistic reporting. The State Department produced cables that contradicted the Pentagon's claims about the progress of pacification. Individual analysts within the Defense Department produced studies that showed the attrition strategy was not working, that enemy recruitment was replacing losses faster than they could be inflicted, that the body count figures were unreliable, and that the South Vietnamese government did not have the popular legitimacy to sustain itself without continuous American support at levels the United States could not maintain indefinitely. These assessments were received, filed, and largely ignored. The officials who produced them were not fired or punished in most cases. They were simply not listened to, which produced a more insidious dynamic than outright suppression, because it meant that the system could claim, and did claim, that dissenting information had been considered, when in practice it had been processed without effect. This is one of the things the Army did not want discussed after the war, because it was too damaging to the concept of institutional competence. The military preferred the narrative that it had been let down by the politicians, that it had been fighting with one hand tied behind its back, that it could have won if allowed to apply its full power without restriction. This narrative, which became known as the stab-in-the-back theory, and which was popularized in certain military and conservative circles after the war, served important institutional purposes. It redirected blame from the military's own analytical failures onto civilian decision-makers and anti-war protesters and the press. It allowed the officer corps to emerge from Vietnam without fundamentally revising its understanding of how wars are won. And it was, in the judgment of most serious historians of the period, wrong. The military had not been prevented from winning by political constraints. The military had been operating within a conflict that did not have a military solution, and the political constraints it complained about were in most cases reasonable responses to the risk of escalation into direct confrontation with China or the Soviet Union. Escalation that American leaders across administrations correctly identified as catastrophic. The frustration of field commanders was real, and their desire for more freedom of action was genuine. But the freedom they sought would not have changed the fundamental dynamics of the war. It would have killed more people while producing the same result, or a worse one. The bombing of North Vietnam illustrated this clearly. The United States dropped more bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia combined than it dropped in all of World War II, across all theaters. More. The number is not a rhetorical exaggeration, it is a documented figure. The bombing campaigns were the most intense sustained aerial bombardment in the history of warfare, and they did not break the North Vietnamese will to fight, did not substantially reduce the flow of supplies and personnel down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, did not prevent the Tet Offensive of 1968, did not prevent the Easter Offensive of 1972, and did not prevent the final North Vietnamese victory in 1975. What the bombing did do was kill large numbers of civilians in both North and South Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, drive millions of people from their homes, devastate agricultural infrastructure, and create a legacy of unexploded ordnance that was still killing and maiming people in those countries decades after the war ended. The civilian casualties from the bombing were not discussed openly by the military or the government during the war. They were acknowledged in the vague language of collateral damage, a term that was itself a product of institutional need, a way of naming something without describing it, of accepting responsibility without accepting accountability. The actual numbers of Vietnamese civilians killed by American air power were not compiled by the United States military in any systematic way that was made public. Estimates from various sources ranged widely. The true figure has never been established to universal agreement and probably cannot be, given the destruction of records and the chaos of the conflict. What is clear is that the number was large, that the military knew it was large, and that the knowledge was managed rather than confronted. The management of knowledge about civilian casualties ran parallel to the management of knowledge about specific incidents of atrocity. The massacre at My Lai in March of 1968, in which soldiers of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry killed somewhere between 300 and 500 Vietnamese civilians in the village of Sun Mai, was not reported honestly by the military when it occurred. The official report described a combat operation resulting in enemy casualties. The cover-up involved officers at multiple levels of command. It lasted for more than a year before journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story in November of 1969. When the story became public, the military's response was to investigate, charge a number of soldiers, convict one, and sentence him to life imprisonment, after which he was pardoned and released within 3.5 years. 30 members of the unit had been originally charged. One was convicted. The chain of command that had covered up the massacre and that had created and sustained the conditions that made the massacre possible was not meaningfully held accountable. General Samuel Coster, who commanded the American Division at the time and who knew or should have known about the massacre, had his rank reduced from Major General to Brigadier General and received a censure which ended his career but did not result in criminal prosecution. The message sent through the institution by this outcome was clear and was clearly received. The system would perform accountability without delivering it. My Lai was not an isolated incident. This is one of the things the Army did not want discussed, and one of the things that is most thoroughly documented by the work of investigative journalists, the testimony of veterans before Congress, and the research of historians including Nick Turse, whose book, Kill Anything That Moves, drew on declassified military records to argue that systematic violence against Vietnamese civilians was a predictable product of the war's tactics, command culture, and institutional pressures, not any aberration. Turse's research identified hundreds of incidents in military records that described killings of civilians, destruction of villages and other violations of the laws of war, incidents that had been investigated internally and then buried, incidents that had produced paperwork that sat in archives for decades before anyone looked at it carefully. The military disagreed with some of Turse's conclusions and disputed some of his characterizations. But the core of his argument, that there were many incidents like My Lai that were never publicly disclosed, has not been seriously refuted. Veterans who testified before the Winter Soldier investigation in 1971, organized by Vietnam Veterans Against the War, described experiences that corroborated the pattern. Their testimony was largely dismissed at the time as left-wing agitation or self-dramatization. Some of the veterans were later subjected to military and government surveillance and discrediting campaigns. Their accounts are now regarded by most historians as substantially accurate. The Winter Soldier investigation is one of those events that exists in the historical record, but has never been fully absorbed into the public understanding of the war. More than 100 veterans testified over 3 days in Detroit about things they had witnessed or participated in. They described free-fire zones where anything that moved was considered a legitimate target. They described the routine use of torture during interrogations. They described the killing of prisoners. They described the deliberate destruction of crops and food supplies. They described rape. They described the treatment of Vietnamese people, including allies, as racially inferior. The use of dehumanizing language that was not incidental slang, but was systematically taught and reinforced as a way of reducing psychological inhibition against killing. They described all of this calmly in organized testimony before witnesses, and the mainstream media covered it minimally, and the government dismissed it, and the military ignored it. The dehumanization of the Vietnamese was not an accident or a side effect. It was functional. Soldiers who are going to be asked to kill people in ambiguous circumstances, who cannot reliably distinguish combatants from non-combatants, who are operating in a climate of constant threat from an invisible enemy, require some mechanism for managing the psychological weight of what they are doing. Dehumanization is one of the oldest of these mechanisms. The training that American soldiers received before and during deployment in Vietnam systematically referred to Vietnamese people with slurs that reduced them to something less than human, something easier to kill. This was not unknown to the officers who supervised the training. It was, at some levels of the system, deliberate. The consequences of this ran in multiple directions simultaneously. It made soldiers more willing to kill in ambiguous circumstances, which the military found useful. It also made soldiers more willing to kill in circumstances that were not ambiguous at all, which occasionally became publicly embarrassing. It created a pattern of behavior toward Vietnamese civilians, including civilians who were theoretically on the American side, that undermined the pacification mission, which was supposed to be winning hearts and minds. And it damaged the soldiers themselves in ways that took years and sometimes decades to fully manifest, ways that the military was slow to recognize and slower still to address. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not a recognized diagnosis in 1968. The symptoms that would later be organized under that label were known by various names: combat fatigue, shell shock, operational exhaustion, and they had been observed in veterans of previous wars. But the specific pattern of symptoms that Vietnam veterans presented in unusually high numbers, the persistent intrusive memories, the hypervigilance, the emotional numbing, the inability to function in civilian contexts, the substance abuse, the suicide attempts, these were initially treated as personal weakness rather than injury, as moral failure rather than psychological damage. Veterans who sought help were often told that their problems were their own, that readjustment was simply a matter of will and discipline, that the men who had fought in World War II had come home and gotten on with their lives, and there was no reason Vietnam veterans should be different. The reason they were different was partly the nature of the war itself, which offered none of the moral clarity or social support that World War II veterans had received, and partly the specific experiences that Vietnam produced, and partly the way they came home, individually on commercial flights within days of their last combat patrol, rather than collectively on troop ships over weeks in the company of the men they had served with. They came home alone, and they came home to a country that was deeply divided about the war, and in many cases hostile to the men who had fought it, and they came home carrying things that had no name yet, and that the institutions around them were not equipped to receive. The Veterans Administration in the years immediately after Vietnam was not prepared for the volume or the nature of the need. Waiting times for mental health treatment were long. The quality of care was inconsistent. The people providing care frequently had no experience with combat trauma. Veterans who presented with severe symptoms were sometimes diagnosed with pre-existing personality disorders, a diagnostic choice that happened to release the military from financial liability for their treatment. This was documented. The practice of diagnosing veterans with personality disorders in order to avoid service-connected disability claims was identified as a pattern by veteran advocacy organizations and eventually by congressional investigations. It was not resolved quickly or completely. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans was higher than among non-veterans of the same age group and has remained elevated for decades. The number of Vietnam veterans who died by suicide after the war is estimated by various sources to exceed the number who were killed in combat, though the precise figure is disputed because suicide statistics were not tracked systematically in relation to veteran status for many years. What is known is that the war's damage did not end when the war ended for the men who fought it, and that the institutions responsible for those men were slow to acknowledge the scope of that damage and slower still to address it. The war's damage to the Vietnamese population did not end when the war ended either. The bombing of Laos, which was the most heavily bombed country per capita in history, as a result of American air campaigns targeting the Ho Chi Minh Trail and supporting the Laotian government against communist forces, left an estimated 80 million unexploded cluster munitions scattered across the countryside. By the early 21st century, more than 20,000 people had been killed or injured by this unexploded ordnance since the end of the war. The rate of casualties had declined over time but had not stopped. Children were still being killed. Farmers were still being killed. The landscape itself had been made lethal, not temporarily, but for a period that would likely exceed the lifetimes of everyone alive when the bombs were dropped. The use of Agent Orange and other herbicides in the systematic defoliation program called Operation Ranch Hand created a different kind of lasting damage. Millions of gallons of herbicides, many of them contaminated with dioxin, one of the most toxic substances known, were sprayed over large areas of South Vietnam over a period of years. The stated purpose was to deny the enemy cover and destroy food supplies. The effect on Vietnamese civilians living in sprayed areas included elevated rates of cancer, birth defects, miscarriages, and other health problems that persisted across generations. American veterans who had been exposed to the chemicals reported similar health problems. The government's response to veterans' claims about Agent Orange exposure was to dispute the connection between exposure and illness for years, to fund research that produced inconclusive results, and eventually to make limited acknowledgement and offer limited compensation. The Vietnamese civilian victims of Agent Orange received no compensation from the United States government. Lawsuits filed on their behalf were dismissed by American courts on various grounds. The Vietnamese Red Cross estimated that as many as 3 million Vietnamese people were affected by Agent Orange exposure and its consequences. The United States government disputed those figures and disputed the causal connections. The scientific literature on the subject is complex and contested in its details, but the broad picture of serious ongoing harm is not seriously disputed. What has been disputed with some success from a legal standpoint is the financial and moral responsibility for that harm. This capacity for disputing responsibility while acknowledging harm is one of the most consistent features of how the United States government handled the consequences of Vietnam over the decades following the war. The Pentagon Papers, leaked by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971, documented that multiple administrations had systematically deceived Congress and the public about the war's progress, prospects, and costs. The response to this revelation was not accountability. It was a legal battle over Ellsberg's right to leak the documents, a battle the government lost when the Supreme Court ruled against prior restraint of publication, and a slow institutional process of damage management that never produced anything resembling a genuine reckoning. The Pentagon Papers themselves are worth dwelling on, because they illustrated something about the nature of the deception that was more subtle and in some ways more disturbing than simple lying. What the documents showed was that the people making decisions about the war frequently knew that the war was not going well, knew that the strategies being employed were not achieving their stated objectives, knew that the enemy was stronger and more resilient than public statements acknowledged, and continued anyway. They continued not because they believed they were going to win, but because they did not know how to stop, because stopping required admitting failure, and failure had been defined as politically unacceptable, because each administration inherited the commitments of the previous one and found the costs of honoring those commitments lower in institutional terms than the costs of repudiating them. This is not the same as saying that the people involved were simply cynical or corrupt, though some were both. It is saying something more disturbing, which is that intelligent, and in some cases genuinely well-intentioned people, can sustain an enterprise they know to be failing for years because the institutional logic that surrounds them makes continuation appear less costly than stopping, even when the human cost of continuation is enormous and visible and real. The war machine developed its own momentum. The bureaucracy that had grown up to manage the war, the logistics chains, the contractor relationships, the intelligence programs, the advisory missions, the training programs, had its own institutional interests that were not identical to the national interest and that were not well served by ending the war. The financial dimensions of the war were also something the army did not want discussed with full transparency. The war was enormously profitable for defense contractors. Weapon systems that would otherwise have remained theoretical were tested and refined in combat. Ammunition was consumed in quantities that required continuous production. The defense industry that Eisenhower had warned about in his farewell address 9 years before the major American escalation had, by the mid-1960s, become deeply integrated into the political economy of the United States, in ways that made de-escalation financially and politically complicated independently of any military considerations. The men who owned the companies that made the helicopters and the bombs and the napalm and the defoliants were not losing anything from the continuation of the war. They were profiting from it. This is a fact that was present in public discourse during the war, was part of the anti-war movement's critique, and was largely filtered out of the mainstream institutional post-war narrative. The dominant explanation for the war's continuation became strategic miscalculation and political pressure, which placed the responsibility at the level of decision-making rather than at the level of financial incentive. Both explanations have validity. They are not mutually exclusive, but the financial dimension has received less sustained attention than the strategic and political dimensions in most mainstream historical accounts. And the people who raised it loudest were often dismissed as radicals whose economic analysis was ideologically motivated rather than factually grounded. The racial dynamics of the war inside the military deserved more attention than they received at the time and still receive. By the late 1960s, the relationship between the civil rights movement at home and the experience of black soldiers in Vietnam had produced a situation that military leadership found difficult to manage and more difficult to discuss. Black soldiers had been fighting in a military that had only been formally desegregated by executive order in 1948, and that in practice remained deeply divided along racial lines in terms of assignments, promotions, and social life. They were fighting a war in which the people they were killing were people of color, fighting in the name of a government that was simultaneously resisting their own civil rights at home. The political contradictions were obvious and were increasingly discussed among black soldiers in Vietnam. The military's response to racial tension in Vietnam units was frequently to treat it as a discipline problem rather than a social problem. Black soldiers who raised political objections were sometimes charged with insubordination or more serious offenses. The racial composition of military prisons in Vietnam was disproportionately black. The rates of disciplinary action against black soldiers were higher than against white soldiers. Fraternization across racial lines was managed differently in different commands, with some commanders tolerating and others actively discouraging interracial socializing. The institution that was supposed to be a great equalizer was not operating as one. The relationship between race and the war came to a head in several documented incidents of racial conflict within American military units and installations. Riots in military stockades, confrontations between black and white soldiers in rear areas, the development of distinct subcultures within units, with different music, different slang, different political allegiances, and intermittent violence between them. These incidents were investigated internally and their results were largely classified or quietly filed. They did not become part of the public narrative of the war in proportion to their frequency or significance. They were, instead, an uncomfortable category of reality that the institution processed through its disciplinary mechanisms while declining to acknowledge their systemic causes. The practice of fragging, The killing or attempted killing of officers or NCOs by their own soldiers was another category of reality that the military managed through institutional silence. The term came from the use of fragmentation grenades, which were the weapon of choice because they left no ballistic evidence, but the practice included other methods. The military tracked incidents of assault on officers and NCOs by enlisted men, and the numbers, while disputed in their specifics, indicated that the practice was not rare. Some estimates put the number of fragging incidents in the hundreds over the course of the war. Others put it higher. What is clear is that the rate increased over time as the war continued and morale deteriorated, that it was concentrated in combat units under particular stress, and that it represented a profound breakdown of the command relationships on which military effectiveness depends. The military investigated fraggings and prosecuted some cases, but the institutional response was also to manage the information carefully. Incidents were sometimes coded in reports in ways that reduced their visibility as a category. The broader implications of soldiers killing their own officers, implications about the state of morale, the legitimacy of the mission, the quality of leadership, the overall coherence of the force, were not subjects that the military wanted to bring to public attention. They were handled as individual criminal matters, each case prosecuted or not on its own terms, without any public acknowledgement of the pattern. The pattern had causes that ran through the entire structure of the military's presence in Vietnam by the late 1960s and early 1970s. The rotation system, which moved individual soldiers in and out of Vietnam on one-year tours rather than keeping units together through the war, had been adopted partly for morale and manpower reasons, but had the effect of destroying unit cohesion. New soldiers arrived knowing nothing, and experienced soldiers departed before they could pass on what they had learned, and the result was a force in which collective knowledge and collective trust kept resetting. Units that had been in Vietnam for months had effective institutional memory measured in weeks because the people who held that memory had rotated out. This created a situation in which the same mistakes were made repeatedly, in which dangerous areas were treated as unknown because the men who knew them were gone, in which the learning curve was never completed because it was perpetually restarted. The military had designed this system partly to manage the domestic political optics of the war, to prevent any particular group of soldiers from bearing a disproportionate share of the burden over time, and partly because of genuine concerns about long-term combat stress in a war with no clear end. The effect on operational effectiveness was negative and measurable, and was known to be negative and was discussed internally. The system was not changed because changing it would have required changing the political calculus of how the war was being managed domestically, and that calculus did not have military effectiveness as its primary variable. The question of drug use in Vietnam is another area where the gap between official reality and lived reality was enormous, and where the military's institutional response prioritized management over honesty. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the use of marijuana, heroin, and other substances among American soldiers in Vietnam had reached levels that senior commanders acknowledged privately were affecting operational readiness. Heroin, in particular, was widely available in Vietnam, of extremely high purity compared to what was available on American streets, and was being used by soldiers at rates that various surveys, some commissioned by the military itself, suggested were quite high among certain categories of personnel. The military's response was a combination of enforcement, which was uneven and often counterproductive, and a treatment program called Operation Golden Flow, which required soldiers to pass urine tests before departing Vietnam and offered amnesty and treatment to those who tested positive. This program reduced the number of soldiers who returned to the United States actively addicted to heroin, which was the visible outcome the institution needed, but it did not address the causes of drug use or provide sustained treatment, and a substantial number of veterans who had developed dependencies in Vietnam continued to struggle with them after returning home. The military had solved its public relations problem by the end of the war without solving the underlying problem. and the veterans who carried those dependencies home were now civilians for whom the military bore no further institutional responsibility. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 is perhaps the single event in the war that most clearly illustrated the distance between official narrative and operational reality. The offensive, in which North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched simultaneous coordinated attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, including the American Embassy compound in Saigon, was a military failure for the attacking forces in conventional terms. The attackers suffered enormous casualties. They did not hold their objectives. The expected popular uprising in support of the communist forces did not materialize. By the narrow metrics of territorial control and enemy casualties, the United States and South Vietnam could be said to have won. But the Tet Offensive destroyed the American public's willingness to continue believing the official narrative of the war in a way that no previous event had. The reason was simple. The American public had been told repeatedly by senior military and civilian officials in the months before Tet that the war was progressing favorably, that the enemy was degraded and on the defensive, that the end was approaching. General William Westmoreland had given a speech in November of 1967, claiming that the enemy was unable to mount a major offensive, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. 2 months later, the enemy mounted the largest coordinated offensive of the war. The gap between what Americans had been told and what they saw on their television screens was too large to bridge with the usual explanations. The credibility of the military and the Johnson administration on the subject of Vietnam effectively ended with Tet. What the military found intolerable about this outcome was not the military failure, which was real but not catastrophic in operational terms, but the psychological defeat, the collapse of public trust that made continued escalation politically impossible. The lesson that the military drew from this varied by individual and faction. Some drew the lesson that the military should manage information about the war more carefully, should be more cautious about making optimistic claims that could be falsified by events. Others drew the lesson that the press, which had reported the Tet Offensive in ways that the military believed exaggerated its significance, was an adversary that needed to be controlled or managed more effectively. Very few drew the lesson that the optimistic claims had been wrong, not because of poor media management, but because they reflected a fundamental misreading of the war's trajectory. The relationship between the military and the press in Vietnam was a subject of sustained mutual grievance. The military believed that critical press coverage undermined the war effort and encouraged the enemy. The press, or at least the significant part of it that was operating independently and seriously, believed that it was doing its job by reporting what it observed rather than what it was told. The photographers and reporters who were in the field, who were seeing the reality of the war from a position independent of the military's information management apparatus, were producing a record that contradicted the official narrative, and the official narrative could not be sustained against that record indefinitely. The photographs from Vietnam, Eddie Adams's photograph of the Saigon police chief executing a prisoner in the street during Tet, Nick Utt's photograph of a young girl running naked and burning from a napalm strike, the photographs from My Lai that Ron Haberle had taken and that ended up in Life magazine, these images entered the culture in ways that words could not, and that no amount of official counter-narrative could fully contain. They made visible things that had been confined to reports and testimony and official language that could be managed and framed. They were specific. They showed individual human beings in moments of extreme suffering and extreme violence, and the specificity defeated the abstraction. The military response to the problem of photographic evidence was not to stop doing the things being photographed, but to increase control over access, to embed journalists more tightly within the command structure, to manage the conditions under which photographs could be taken and what could be photographed. This approach was more fully developed in subsequent American military interventions and became the standard model. In Vietnam, the press had operated with a degree of independence that later administrations and military commands found, in retrospect, politically inconvenient, and the lessons learned about controlling information were applied systematically in later conflicts. The pacification program, which was supposed to be the political military strategy that would actually win the war by securing the loyalty of the South Vietnamese population, was one of the most thoroughly documented failures of the American effort. The program operated under various names and organizational frameworks over the course of the war, from strategic hamlets under the early Kennedy years to CORDS, the Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support Program, in the later years. It consumed enormous resources. It produced statistics that were reported up the chain of command as indicators of success. Those statistics were, by most analyses, significantly inflated and did not reflect actual changes in the security situation or in the political loyalties of the rural population. The Strategic Hamlet program under Diem had required rural Vietnamese to abandon their homes and ancestral lands and move to fortified enclosures, a process that created enormous resentment and that the Viet Cong exploited effectively for recruitment. When the program was evaluated honestly, it had done more damage to the political position of the South Vietnamese government than the enemy attacks it was designed to prevent. But by the time honest evaluation was possible, the program had generated years of positive reporting that had shaped political and military decisions at the highest levels, and the people who had produced that reporting were not in a position to acknowledge how misleading it had been. The relationship between the United States and the South Vietnamese government it was supporting was one of the most consistently dishonest features of the American war effort and one of the least discussed. The United States needed the South Vietnamese government to be legitimate, to represent a genuine popular alternative to the communist movement, to be capable of governing and defending the country with American support. The South Vietnamese government, through most of the war's history, was none of those things. It was corrupt, fractious, dependent on American support for its survival, unable to build the popular base that the American war effort required it to have, and was known to be all of these things by American officials who dealt with it directly. The cables from American ambassadors and advisors in Saigon over the years of the war constitute a remarkable record of officially delivered bad news that was processed without changing the fundamental direction of policy. Ambassador Maxwell Taylor wrote cables describing the South Vietnamese government's incapacity and corruption. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge wrote cables describing the same. American advisors at the province and district level filed reports describing the gap between the government's official reach and its actual authority in the countryside. All of this information was received in Washington and processed by institutions that had too much invested in the existing policy to allow the information to change it. The result was that American officials continued to describe the South Vietnamese government in public as a viable ally, while their private communications described it as a serious liability. The South Vietnamese military, the ARVN, was the subject of a similar dual narrative. American commanders praised the ARVN in public statements and briefings, while privately describing units that were poorly led, inadequately motivated, prone to high desertion rates, and largely incapable of sustained independent operations against the North Vietnamese. American soldiers who served alongside ARVN units often held them in poor regard, though the quality varied significantly by unit and commander. The best ARVN units were genuinely effective. The worst were genuinely unreliable. The average was closer to the worst than the best, and the American advisory effort that was supposed to improve the ARVN's effectiveness never fully succeeded in doing so, partly because the problems were structural and political rather than merely technical. The Vietnamization program, which Nixon announced as the policy of gradually transferring combat responsibility to the ARVN while reducing American troop levels, was publicly presented as a path to a stable South Vietnamese military capable of defending the country independently. Most serious analysts within the government believed it was not. The ARVN could absorb American training and equipment, and it could fight with American air power and logistics support. But its fundamental weaknesses, the poor quality of much of its officer corps, the corruption that siphoned resources away from soldiers in the field, the lack of genuine national ideology to motivate its soldiers in the way that revolutionary nationalism motivated their opponents, were not problems that Vietnamization could solve. They were problems that reflected the nature of the South Vietnamese political system, and that system could not be reformed from outside by the United States without taking over the government, which would have destroyed the entire rationale for American involvement. The Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 were described publicly as an honorable settlement of the war, a phrase that came from the Nixon administration and that was recognized at the time by most analysts as something other than accurate. The accords did not end the fighting. They allowed for the withdrawal of American forces while leaving North Vietnamese forces in place in the South, which was a significant and essentially unreciprocated concession. Henry Kissinger, who negotiated the accords and shared the Nobel Peace Prize for doing so, later acknowledged in various formulations that the administration did not believe the settlement was durable. The North Vietnamese, it was widely understood at the time, viewed the accords as a pause rather than a conclusion, as a means of securing American withdrawal before resuming the military campaign that would eventually produce their victory. The 2-year interval between the Paris Accords and the fall of Saigon in April 1975 was thus not a failure of the peace settlement, but an execution of it. From the North Vietnamese perspective, they had negotiated an American withdrawal, waited a sufficient period, and then completed the military campaign that the war had always been, from their perspective, about. The South Vietnamese government, without American air power and with reduced American logistical support following the congressional restrictions that reduced aid after 1973, could not hold against a conventional North Vietnamese offensive. It collapsed faster than even pessimistic American analysts had predicted. The fall of Saigon was watched by American officials and military officers with a complex mixture of emotions, including relief that it was finally over, grief for the Vietnamese who had worked with the Americans and were now in danger, anger at the Vietnamese allies who seemed to some observers to be abandoning their positions without sufficient fight, and a persistent unwillingness among many in the military to accept that the war had ended as it did, because it was always going to end as it did. The evacuation of the American embassy, the helicopters lifting from the rooftop, the South Vietnamese civilians climbing the walls, the desperate crowding at the docks, was the visible conclusion of an enterprise that had been founded on false premises and sustained by false reports and defended with institutional intransigence for 2 decades. The soldiers who had served in Vietnam and returned watched the fall of Saigon from American living rooms and bars and VA waiting rooms and the various private places where Vietnam veterans had taken up residence in an American society that did not quite know what to do with them. For many of them, the fall produced a kind of confirmation of what they had believed for years, which was that the war had been unwinnable from the beginning, and that the men who had said so had been correct and had been ignored and sometimes punished for being correct. For others, it produced a grief that was not separable from the grief they already carried about the friends they had lost, which was now attached to the additional weight of knowing that the thing they had lost those friends for had concluded as it had. The official accounting of what went wrong took years to develop and was never complete. The Army commissioned a formal study that produced the document sometimes called the Army's Vietnam Study or the Depuis Report, and there were other institutional reviews. These reviews identified many of the problems that have been described here: the inadequate intelligence, the flawed strategy, the corrupted metrics, the misplaced confidence in attrition warfare, the insufficient attention to political factors. They were largely internal documents that shaped subsequent military doctrine without producing a public accounting of institutional responsibility. The Army learned, in the way institutions learn, by adjusting its procedures and its training and its doctrinal frameworks, without the kind of public reckoning that would have required naming names and assigning individual responsibility for decisions that had cost many thousands of lives. The cultural impact of Vietnam on the American military took decades to work through and is arguably not complete. The immediate post-Vietnam military was, by most accounts, in poor shape. Morale was low. Drug use remained a problem. The all-volunteer force that replaced the draft after Vietnam faced serious recruitment difficulties in its early years. The officer corps was demoralized by a war that had produced more general officers per capita than any previous conflict, while ending in obvious failure. The relationship between the military and civilian society was strained in ways that had not been experienced since the Civil War. The term Vietnam Syndrome, which began as a pejorative used by those who believed it described an irrational American reluctance to use military force, became instead a shorthand for a kind of hard-won skepticism about military intervention that a significant portion of the American public had earned by experience. The Reagan administration's effort to reframe Vietnam as, in Reagan's phrase, a noble cause, was an attempt to manage this cultural legacy in a politically useful direction. The reframing required arguing that the war had been morally justified and militarily winnable, that it had been lost by lack of political will rather than strategic error, and that the proper response to Vietnam was not caution about future interventions, but a renewed confidence in American military power. This framing found a receptive audience in parts of the military, in parts of the conservative political establishment, and in parts of the veteran community. It conflicted directly with the detailed historical record, but historical records are not always the primary drivers of cultural narratives, and the noble cause framing was powerful enough that it shaped policy and rhetoric well into the subsequent decades. The men who had been there and who knew what had happened generally did not find the noble cause framing convincing. They knew what they had seen. They knew what had been asked of them, and under what conditions, and to what end. Many of them carried physical and psychological wounds that were not compatible with the triumphalist revision of what they had experienced. But their voices, like the voices of those who had testified at Winter Soldier, like the voices of the intelligence analysts who had written honest assessments and been ignored, like the voices of the field officers who had filed accurate reports and found them unwelcome, were present in the record without being central to the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative of the Vietnam War in American culture settled, over time, into a shape that was more comfortable than the evidence supported. It acknowledged the tragedy. It honored the soldiers. It accepted that the war had been a mistake, though the nature of the mistake remained contested. It absorbed the specific horror of My Lai as an aberration rather than a symptom. It treated the institutional lying and the corrupted metrics and the suppressed reports and the managed casualty figures as failures of individuals in extraordinary circumstances rather than as features of a system functioning as systems do. It made room for grief and for the wall in Washington and for the delayed recognition of veterans who had been poorly treated on their return. It did not make room for the full accounting of how the war was managed, sustained, and finally ended, because that accounting was too damaging to too many institutions that were still functioning and still needed to maintain public confidence in their legitimacy. The Vietnamese dimension of this legacy was even less present in American cultural processing of the war. The millions of Vietnamese people who died, who were displaced, who were contaminated by Agent Orange, who were maimed by unexploded ordnance, who spent years in re-education camps after the communist victory, who fled the country by boat and across land borders, who built lives in refugee communities around the world. These people and their experiences appeared at the margins of the American narrative rather than at its center. The war had been, in American cultural terms, primarily about America, about what Vietnam did to American soldiers and American society and American confidence and American policy, and the Vietnamese were cast as the landscape in which this American story took place rather than as the primary subjects of the catastrophe. This centering of American experience was not deliberate exclusion in most cases. It was a natural consequence of telling stories from within your own perspective, of caring most about your own losses, of processing your own institution's failures through your own cultural frameworks. But it had the effect of creating a narrative in which the most important facts, the enormous scale of Vietnamese suffering, The agency and complexity of the Vietnamese parties to the conflict, the political and historical context in which the war took place, remained systematically underweighted relative to the internal American story of confusion and disillusionment and failed institutional performance. The institutional lessons that the military drew from Vietnam were primarily technical and procedural. Better intelligence, clearer objectives, more realistic metrics, more attention to the political dimensions of counterinsurgency, smaller footprints, faster operations. These lessons were real and were applied with varying degrees of success and failure in subsequent American military engagements. What was not drawn as a lesson in any sustained institutional way was the lesson about what happens when an institution's information management systems are designed to produce acceptable reporting rather than accurate reporting, when the pressure to show progress is greater than the pressure to report reality, when the metrics substitute for the thing being measured so completely that the people managing the metrics forget that the substitution has occurred. That lesson was not fully learned because learning it would have required an honest institutional accounting of what the metrics had been hiding and who had known they were inadequate and what decisions had been made on the basis of reporting that the decision makers had reason to question. It would have required a kind of institutional honesty that was not structurally available, that the reward systems and the career structures and the political needs of the various bureaucracies involved did not support. And so the specific mechanisms of deception were modified, while the underlying tendency that produced them remained in place, waiting for the next set of conditions that would call it back into operation. The men who served in Vietnam as advisors in the early years, the small unit advisors who lived in Vietnamese villages and worked with Vietnamese troops and developed genuine on-the-ground knowledge of the war, were among the most clear-eyed observers of what was happening and among the least listened to. They filed reports describing the political situation as they observed it, the actual state of the South Vietnamese military units they were advising, the genuine attitudes of the rural population, the strength and sophistication of the Viet Cong infrastructure in areas that official reporting described as secure. Some of them were told that their reports were unhelpful. Some of them were told that their assessments were too pessimistic. Some of them were told in various ways that the information they were providing contradicted the information that was needed and that they should reconsider their evaluations. Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Vann, one of the most legendary figures in the American advisory effort, spent years trying to get honest reporting to take hold in the American military establishment and largely failed. He believed that the war could have been conducted differently, that a genuine counterinsurgency strategy focused on political development and honest evaluation could have produced a different outcome. He may have been right about the possibility of a different approach and wrong about whether the American military and political establishment had the capacity to execute it. His story is documented in Neil Sheehan's enormous and carefully researched book, and what emerges from that documentation is not a portrait of a lone, honest man against a dishonest system, but of a system that was constitutionally unable to absorb what honest men were telling it, because absorbing that information would have required changing too much. The change that was required was not primarily strategic, it was institutional. It was a change in the relationship between reporting and reward, between honesty and career advancement, between accurate assessment and institutional acceptance. It was the kind of change that institutions resist most strongly because it is the kind that threatens the status of the people within them who have succeeded by learning to navigate the existing system. The American military in Vietnam was full of intelligent, capable, brave people who had learned to navigate a system that rewarded positive reporting and punished pessimism, and the navigation they had learned made them worse at their actual jobs while making them more successful at their institutional careers. And they passed that navigation to the people who came after them because that was how the institution reproduced itself. The war lasted longer than it should have and cost more than it needed to and ended as it was always going to end. and through most of its duration, the institutions involved managed the information about it in ways designed to prevent the people outside those institutions from understanding what was happening. The soldiers who knew what was happening could not report it accurately without consequences. The analysts who understood what the reports meant could not act on that understanding without consequences. The officers who saw the failure of the strategy could not say so clearly without consequences. And so the war continued, cycling through the same terrain, reporting the same enemy who kept coming back, measuring the same metrics that kept failing to measure, sustained by the institutional momentum of an enterprise that had outgrown the purposes that had originally justified it, that existed now because it existed, and because stopping it was harder than continuing it. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in March of 1973. American advisors remained. American air support continued for a period. American money flowed to the South Vietnamese government until Congress restricted it. And when the North Vietnamese offensive came in the spring of 1975, the South Vietnamese military, without the American air power it had come to depend on, without the logistical support that American money had funded, without the political confidence that American backing had sustained, collapsed in ways that surprised even the most pessimistic observers by their speed. Cities fell in days that were expected to hold for weeks. Units that were supposed to fight retreated or disintegrated. The government that the United States had spent 20 years and more than 58,000 American lives trying to build did not exist as a self-sustaining entity when the American support that had built it was withdrawn. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The war was over. The American involvement had lasted, depending on how you count, between 20 and 30 years. The direct major combat commitment had lasted about a decade. The final outcome was exactly what the pessimists had predicted and the optimists had denied, and the institutions had spent years trying to prevent from being said out loud, which was that a war fought on false premises, with falsified metrics and managed information and corrupted accountability, had ended in the way that such wars tend to end, and the ending had been visible for a long time before it arrived. The veterans came home to a country that was trying to move on. The institutions that had managed the war were trying to move on. The politicians who had sustained the war were trying to move on. The contractors who had profited from the war had already moved on to the next set of contracts. And the war itself, the actual physical war, the landscape of bomb craters and defoliated forests and contaminated soil and unexploded ordnance, the continuing suffering of people who had been in the path of all of it, continued in ways that did not make the news in America, and did not enter the American reckoning, and did not change the shape of the institutional narratives that were already forming around what the war had been, and what it had meant, and who was responsible for how it ended. The files that documented the corrupted reports and the falsified body counts and the suppressed assessments and the managed casualties were declassified over decades, piece by piece, and researchers found them and wrote about them, and the information entered the historical record and was available to anyone who wanted to find it. The information being available did not mean it was acted on. The institutions that had produced the falsified reports were still functioning. The people who had managed the information had mostly retired or died. The successor institutions had learned some lessons and ignored others, and were managing their own information in their own ways, for their own institutional reasons. The war was over, and the war was not over, depending on what you meant by the war and where you were standing when you asked the question.